We put the Rebel Alliance against the UNSC in today's Galactic Versus. Hey guys, this is Eckhart's Letter. Hello and welcome to another Versus episode. And a couple of days ago I told you guys we would see more Versus videos in 2021, and I think I've came through. We've almost reached last year's total in just a week. But today's episode will be a little bit different because the UNSC versus the Rebel Alliance, I think, is a really good representation of why these videos can be hard. So instead of going by section, I'm going to take this matchup holistically and discuss how each faction is different on a fundamental level and what this means for the matchup. Comparing the UNSC versus the Alliance is also difficult because what kind of matchup do we put them in? Is the UNSC defending and the Alliance attacking, sort of standing in for the Covenant? Do both factions have their own territory? There's no right answer, and there's also no right answer for at what point do we take the UNSC? Do we take it in their post-war era when they were the most powerful, but arguably not really truly the UNSC of the Human Covenant War anymore? Or do we take them at their peak? With that being said, let's get started with the matchup, and I want to talk first about logistics and travel time because this is one area where the Star Wars universe has a really big advantage. Star Wars is on a different scale than some of the other science fiction we cover on this channel. Whereas the majority of Halo, at least the modern Halo lore, takes place in a relatively small portion of the galaxy, the Orion Arm, Star Wars operates on a different scale. The entire galaxy sees some action, all 100,000 plus light years of it. There are transgalactic civilizations, people routinely fly from one side of the galaxy to another, so that messes up issues with scale, which we'll have to talk about later, but also really makes things like logistics difficult. Star Wars has extremely fast FTL travel, with the fastest ships being able to travel basically the length of the entire galaxy in perhaps a day or even less. This is a journey that would take even the fastest Covenant ships months to undertake, whereas wartime UNSC vessels just wouldn't be able to make the journey conceivably, and that's why they often have to put soldiers in cryo sleep. This is just because of the fundamentally different nature of the two universes as well. Star Wars, for example, does not seem to be subject to the laws of special and general relativity. Pretty much anything can be sent faster than the speed of light, faster than light communication is possible, pretty much under any circumstances, whereas although humanity has found one way around that specific issue, generally Halo is much more well-grounded in science, although still not grounded in science, especially compared to real hard science fiction, but Star Wars is essentially a space opera. Now, that's not a positive or a negative statement, it's just a factual statement about the two universes. Let's talk generally about military size too, because that's also a key contention. First of all, by the end of the war, it honestly seems like the UNSC was down to maybe 20 ships or less. That seems like an exaggeration, but I honestly think their numbers were that low, at least when talking about anything frigate-sized or above. So obviously we're not going to take the UNSC at that size, it's just way too tiny. And it seems like at their peak during the war, after they had started to remilitarize old vessels, they probably had somewhere around 500 to 700. That is totally just a rough estimate, but in Halo Reach, for example, 60% of the remaining fleet is moving to Reach to try to reinforce the planet. Obviously they were too late, and that was too far in the war to represent the fleet at its peak, but we're not dealing with thousands of ships. Again, Halo only takes place in a single arm of the galaxy, the scale is much smaller. Things must be easier in Star Wars, right? Star Wars has lots of information about fleet sizes and everything else. Well, yes and no. Star Wars' main problem comes from consistency. I mean, at the Battle of Endor, for example, we see the Alliance field maybe 30 to 60 large capital ships. The problem is, you've got to ask yourself whether you prefer the lore that we see exclusively on screen or whether you want to dive into the expanded universe, and for me, this is always a difficult question, and I do try to find a compromise whenever possible. Certainly at its peak, the Rebel Alliance, in my opinion, if you look at numbers from Star Wars Legends and canon, would have been at the very least comparable to the UNSC and most likely larger. When it comes to numbers, I've done a whole video on whether the entire Rebel fleet was at Endor or not. It seems very unlikely. Even before the battle, we get word from Mon Mothma that the Alliance is basically launching using diversions across the entire galaxy. This was meant to be a covert operation, so they were trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy so they could sneak attack the Empire when supposedly they weren't prepared. We've also heard stories of ships and cannon staying behind to protect certain key systems, and the Essential Guide to Warfare outright states that the Alliance fleet was 7% the size of the Imperial Navy, keeping in mind that the Imperial Navy had 25,000 Star Destroyers alone. That gives the Alliance over 1,000 ships, but you might not like those numbers and I totally get it. So here comes the inevitable struggle of putting what we see on screen, where this is an all or nothing battle, versus what's been depicted later in the expanded universe, basically that this still was an all or nothing battle, but there was also an entire galaxy spanning conflict happening. There were bases that needed protecting and fleets, and the Essential Guide to Warfare and some other sources cover this by saying, yeah, well, the Alliance also had sector forces to resist the Empire locally and play defense, which I do think makes some sense and is consistent with Star Wars canon. So that's nice and clear, right? No, of course it's not, and things only continue to get more difficult. We have two factions of indeterminate size fighting in indeterminate war, and now we have to talk about completely divergent levels and types of technology, especially if we're looking at wartime UNSC. So for most of the UNSC's history, they relied on magnetic accelerator cannons for their most powerful weapons. MACs, as the name would suggest, accelerated projectiles to extreme speeds and basically pounded down their enemies. Of course, the Covenant were able to put up a bit of a defense against this, and that made things a lot more difficult. The UNSC, for example, did not have shielding technology. Every single plasma burst sent towards a UNSC ship which hit would cause damage, at least some damage. Coveys had shields, and so would every ship in the Star Wars galaxy. Star Wars capital ships pretty much also use made-up weapons, turbo lasers, giant energy weapons which spout out, well, certainly not lasers, and which can do everything from destroying a capital ship to melting the surface of a planet. Star Wars does seem to have higher energy yields. Base Delta Zeros were not common, but they were possible with a few Star Destroyers, whereas the Covenant's complete glassing of an entire planet, I'm talking the entire surface, boiling the oceans, was not routine and would have taken months. Usually it was just the glassing of major population centers, the destroying of the atmosphere, etc. I think starfighters in Star Wars are also better than their Halo counterparts and are also featured much more heavily in space combat. Starfighters carry these exceptionally high yield weapons which can disable or destroy capital ships, whereas Halo fighters are much larger, they're slower, and they carry weapons more kind of expected for a ship of its size. Still nukes often, but they weren't as frequently the main players in space battles as we see in Star Wars, and I doubt they would have had the same maneuverability or speed as an X-Wing. Something like a nuke too would be a fairly basic weapon in the Star Wars universe. Nukes do exist, but they haven't been used for a very long time, at least according to most Star Wars Legends books. We get mention of nukes, for example, in Plagueis as an antiquated weapon. Star Wars shields can stop projectiles, but I don't know if a Mac gun could pound through them. If we look at the Essential Guide to Warfare, there's a suggestion that no, because technology developed lasers basically in response to increasing shield strength, but Macs are also really powerful, so it's kinda hard to say. The largest of the UNSC cruisers also were fairly damn powerful, but they were rare. The Puna-class supercarrier, for example, was a massive 4 kilometers long, and was of course loaded to the brim with weapons and a very powerful Mac, but vessels of that magnitude were very rare within the UNSC. You can say the exact same about the Rebels, who had a few powerful flagships. MC-80A and Cannon are Home 1 and Legends class, but then lots of smaller cruisers and eventually moving down to frigate and light cruiser size. I don't know, I think you guys can tell that I'm sort of heading towards an answer for this video that's not very satisfying for anybody. Just to be honest, whenever somebody asks me, is a Halo faction going to win or a Star Wars faction, call it bias, but I usually say the Star Wars faction because to me, Star Wars has a higher base level of power, mostly because it's heavily rooted in fantasy. We see larger conflicts, galaxy-spanning wars. We have better technology in some areas, but worse in others. Halo, for example, has AI, which would make a tremendous difference when it comes to wartime strategy. But But there's also arguments you could make for the UNSC. One argument would be that AI. Another would be the range that UNSC fight at, and that's partially because of AI. They will fight at thousands of kilometers sometimes, but also because of how their weapons work. Projectile weapons can fly indefinitely in space, whereas Star Wars weapons fizzle out. That notwithstanding, every fight we've seen in Halo has also taken place at close range, so the debate is difficult. We also have to talk about the post-war UNSC. After the Human Covenant War, the UNSC, although down to, like I said, maybe a dozen or less ships, heavily integrated Forerunner technology into designs moving forward. It's hard to say how many ships they've produced by the time of Halo 4 or 5. My guess would be maybe not more than 150 or 200, but they certainly increased their slip space capabilities and their shields, so maybe at that point they're capable of taking on the Rebel Alliance. I don't know, for example, if there's anything in the Rebel Alliance's fleet on its own that could take down the UNSC Infinity. That thing is an absolute monster. And we haven't even talked yet about the different scenarios that we're fighting in. I think the UNSC would have a better time defending their own planets because that's what they were doing during the war. They have installations set up around many of their planets. They have MAC cannons and something I haven't even touched on yet, arguably a huge advantage on the ground. I focused mostly on space this battle, but the UNSC has Spartans, for Christ's sake. They should be effective at holding territory, performing special ops missions, and whatever else. The Alliance, however, especially given their massive FTL advantage, should be able to do exactly what they did to the Empire against the UNSC, perform very quick raids, pick apart at UNSC forces bit by bit, especially if they don't have shields, and run a guerrilla-style war. Would they be able to hold planets as well as the UNSC? Probably not. So there's another fly in the ointment. At the end, who would win is ultimately up to you. I tend to lean towards wartime UNSC being less powerful than wartime Rebels, both at their peak, but that's because I like the Star Wars Expanded Universe material, and I think it does a good job contextualizing what we see in the movies. If you're a purist and you think the Alliance only has 30 ships, which they fielded at Endor, then you're maybe going to choose the UNSC, unless you think there's a huge power disparity. I hope this was illustrative of the difficulties of these matchups, and although I didn't give a good one-line ending sentence, I hope you nonetheless enjoyed my analysis and my pointing out of the differences between factions and universes. Until next time though, guys, have a good one, be safe, and may the Force be with you.